The Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and your local cable provider presents Cable Reports. Join us now as Cable Reports brings you up to date on current issues facing the Commonwealth through discussions with your local legislators and other policymakers from across Virginia.
From the General Assembly and the City of Richmond, I'm Woody Evans for Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Comcast, connecting Virginians to their government. We're pleased to have with us today Senator Donald McEachin. Good to see you, sir.
Thank you for having me, Woody.
This is the second full week of the 2016 General Assembly session. Tell us how things are going on in the Senate.
Well, we've started doing the people's business, but unfortunately, the Republican majority threw the press off of the floor. I've been here now going into my 9th year as a state senator, and in that entire time, and even before then, the members of the press had floor access. They would sit on either side of the dais where the clerk of the Senate is and where the president of the Senate is, the lieutenant governor, and be able to see us up close, see us up personal, see what we're doing, see what we're saying. And now they've been banned to essentially the balcony in the back. Their constituents are our constituents. They have a job to do, keeping an eye on us, reporting the things that we're trying to do, and they belong on the floor. I hope that by the time this airs, this problem will be fixed, but it is really a problem of the Republican caucus's making. It should have never happened in the first place, and I hope that we'll see the Fourth Estate back on the floor soon.
Now, has this ever happened before in the history of the Senate?
It's my understanding that it may have happened in the 80s, where they reduced the number of tables that the press had, and therefore reduced the number of individuals on the floor. But in my history, and I've been in the legislature since the mid-1990s, this has never happened to my knowledge.
And I understand that there is a bill that has been introduced to overturn that ban?
There is there's a rule change. So it's more of a resolution. And it has been introduced, but it's now on hold. It's been introduced by a Republican Senator Tom Garrett, but it needs 28 votes to amend the rules, and it appears that we don't have the 28 votes yet. All 19 Senate Democrats voted against the rule, are in support of Tom Garrett's amendment to the rules, but at this point we don't have a vote. But again, I hope that it will be solved before this program airs.
Tell us a little bit about your objective as the leader of the Senate Democratic Caucus.
I sort of see my role as multifold. One is to try to coordinate the caucus activities so that each member of the caucus has the ability to say what he or she needs to say, has the resources, the research to make sure that they're accurate and on point, to try as best we can to advance the governor's agenda. He's the head of our political party. We all supported him in the election, obviously, and so we want to see his agenda advance. And at the same time, be able to sort of act as a counterpoint to the majority party, which is obviously the Republican Party in the Senate.
Tell us a little bit about, and give us some highlights from the governor's State of the Commonwealth address, where he set forth some of the priorities that he has this session.
Well, this is his opportunity to write a budget. And he wrote a budget with Medicaid expansion embedded in it. And one of the reasons he did that was to show the people of Virginia what Medicaid expansion really means to their daily lives. It's not just the expansion of health care for 400,000 uninsured, hardworking Virginians. It's also the savings that can come from that and how we spend that savings. Now, the Republicans are resistant to that, and so they're going to have to unwind the budget in order to pass a budget without that. But he didn't do that out of spite, and we don't support him out of spite against the Republicans. This is our way of having a conversation to really show Virginians what Medicaid expansion means. And so as you hear, Republicans doing this and taking money out of the budget, understand that's because they are resistant to Medicaid expansion. In many instances, that'll be the reason. And the people of Virginia can decide whether that's a good thing or a bad thing to have done.
So give us a little bit more detail about those 400,000 who would be eligible for Medicaid if the General Assembly adopted it.
Sure. So when the president wrote the Affordable Care Act, it was sort of like a perfect puzzle, if you will. And part of that puzzle required states to expand Medicaid. When the Supreme Court ruled on the Affordable Care Act, no legal scholar that I know of thought that the Supreme Court would say everything is fine except the mandate to expand Medicaid, right? So the states have to do it voluntarily. Well, the puzzle was all together so that there were monies saved from hospitals, from paying hospitals indigent care money because Medicaid was going to be expanded. But when you pull that puzzle apart, there's a gap. And in that gap, at least in Virginia, there's approximately 400,000 Virginians who go to work every day. So they're too rich to get Medicaid as it presently exists, but too poor to be able to buy it on the exchange. And the folks they work for don't have the resources to provide health insurance. Maybe they don't work 40 hours a week. Maybe they're just a temporary employee. Maybe they work for a small business that just can't swing health care. But nonetheless, we have these folks sitting in the gap, if you will, the gap of that coverage created by the Supreme Court. And in Virginia, it's 400,000 people that we could be helping.
Now, how much money is the state of Virginia losing every day by not accepting the help of the federal government?
If I recall correctly, we're losing about $5 million a day. So
$5 million.
It adds up quickly.
And where is that money going?
It's going to our other states, that are actually expanding Medicaid, whether it's conservative states. The most conservative governor in the country, as he's called, Governor Pence of Indiana, has expanded Medicaid in this fashion. The states that we have to compete with in the Mid-Atlantic region, many of them have expanded it as well. So, Governor McAuliffe often says that he goes out to compete with other states and attract business here, but one of the challenges is that they have a head start because they are benefiting from the savings from the Affordable Care Act, and we are not.
So what's the prognosis to continue the conversation so that the people of Virginia understand what they are losing out on in terms of Medicaid expansion?
That's exactly right, because ultimately, the governor's done what he can do. Democrats in both the Senate and the House have done what we can do. We need the people to weigh in, and the best way to have that conversation is that we know of is to have it through the budget so the folks really understand how they're being hurt by the lack of Medicaid expansion.
Now, what's happening in terms of education, K through 12, our community colleges, and our institutions of higher learning in terms of the governor's priorities?
A lot of exciting things. With K through 12, we're inching our way back to making sure that we're getting the investments we had before the Great Recession. He has invested more money in K through 12 than I can remember in recent history. As far as the community colleges are concerned, we're really being innovative, and we're trying to make sure that they are job training entities in addition to giving out associate's degrees. We want to make sure that they're giving out certificates and other indicia of qualifications so that folks can go out and get good middle-class paying jobs because maybe college isn't for them, right, but a trade is, and so they can learn that trade in our community college system. And then, of course, with higher ed, we have some flagship universities here. We have a great higher ed system, and the governor's invested monies to advance that and protect that system as well.
Now, how are the standards of learning reforms being implemented? Are there still problems there?
There are still problems there. There were many of us in the first instance, and myself included, that were resistant to the standards of learning in the testing in the first instance. Because when I was coming along, as I'm sure when you were coming along, Woody, teachers had an opportunity not only to teach the course, but to impart some wisdom.
Yes.
And now they're teaching the test. They're so focused on teaching the test that they don't have the opportunity to, teach the course and impart wisdom. So we've made some reforms. We've eliminated some tests. We have some more to do.
Now, what about pre-kindergarten? How important is funding of pre-kindergarten?
Well, Kirk Cox, who is the majority leader in the House of Delegates, and I were on a panel, and I was pleased to hear him say that we might be able to find some common ground on pre-K. we know that if we can get a child reading by third grade, that he or she will be successful. We also know that if we don't have a child reading by third grade, there's probably a prison cell or a jail cell waiting for them at some point in their lives. And so making sure that our children are ready for school is critically important, and pre-K is essential to that. It was, Tim Kaine was governor at that time. Governor Tim Kaine, now United States Senator, was a huge advocate for pre-K and really tried to press the envelope there. Unfortunately, he was caught in a recessionary time period. There were limits to what he can do, what he could have done then. But our governor, Governor McAuliffe, is really trying to advance the ball, since we do have not extra money, I shouldn't say it like that, but monies that we haven't had access to in the past.
Now, what about discipline in school that results in suspensions?
Right, that's a particular problem in my county, Henrico County. What we've seen in Henrico is that we've had, while our suspension rate has gone down, African American students as well as special needs students are still disproportionately affected by suspensions. In fact, I think the last statistics I saw that out of the total suspended population, about 70% were African Americans.
70%.
Right, and that is a statistic that's actually ticked upwards just slightly as the overall suspension rates have come down. One of the interesting things I learned on the campaign trail, I was actually out in Culpeper campaigning for our Senate candidate out there, Ned Galloway, and there was a young lady in the audience who was running for town council out there, and she actually won. And she was talking about informed communities. And what she meant by that is that a community that understood that children, and I'm paraphrasing, this might not be how she would say it, but children are fundamentally, like all people, are fundamentally good, and so that when their behavior is affected, the question is not what's wrong with you, but what have you been through? And so what we've done is we've put forward a bill that says, look, suspending a child or expelling a child can happen, but it should be the absolute last alternative that a school district uses. And in doing that, we hope to change that conversation from what's wrong with you to what have you been through. There was a wonderful article, I don't know if you saw it, Woody, by Jim Nolan in the Times-Dispatch about a school in Southwest Virginia that was doing just that. That every Monday, they were ready for the children to come in. If they needed to have a hot meal, they got the hot meal. If they needed some personal hygiene before school started, they got the personal hygiene. And the interesting thing is that it was a Southwest community that demographically was radically different from a Richmond City community or a Henrico County community, but yet encountering the same problems and having some success with those problems. So, and they're just asking the same question. They're not saying what's wrong with you in an accusatory fashion. They're actually trying to see what have you been through and how can we help you fix it.
Well, what's the role of a school resource officer, especially in terms of the school codes? Is that officer required to enforce those codes?
Well, it's my understanding that when the school officials turn a child over to the resource officer and there has been a violation of the law, that resource officer has to make the appropriate charge. To the credit of my county, Henrico County, both our Commonwealth's Attorney, Shannon Taylor, as well as our Chief of Police, they have collaborated together to reduce the number of times the school administration officials are turning to resource officers, because we're putting too many children in the juvenile system that just don't belong there. Things that you and I may have done as second graders or third graders are in many cases being criminalized these days, and that's inappropriate, and I'm happy to see those steps being taken in my home county.
To what extent does the charge of truancy add to that problem?
Truancy adds to that problem. Obviously, truancy, if it becomes chronic, needs to be addressed. But that's not even the tip of the iceberg. We're talking about other types of crimes, whether we're talking about it being assaults, things of that nature.
And of course, our juvenile justice system for the last 20 or 30 years has been focused on more of a punitive kind of thing as opposed to rehabilitation. My understanding is that we should be trying to rehabilitate these children. They still are children.
Absolutely, and I think there are two encouraging things in the juvenile justice front this year in the General Assembly, at least two. One, of course, is the governor's approach to how we incarcerate our juveniles. Historically, it's been hard to distinguish them from prisons or jails, barbed wire, sort of warehousing of people. Not a lot of services, not a lot in the rehabilitation front. A whole lot in terms of punishment and retribution. The governor's put forward a plan now to have a more modern complexes that will still they'll still be secure, but they'll have more of a school-like feel to them, and there'll be more services provided for the young people. Because what we found is that children coming from our juvenile justice system have a high rate of recidivism, and that means the system's not working, and that we need to try another approach. And so we're happy to see the governor's efforts in that regard. The other approach that I'm happy to see is my colleague Ryan McDougall has put forth a bill that will, under certain circumstances, automatically expunge the crimes committed by a juvenile, so that when he comes out or when she comes out of the system, she has a fresh start and she doesn't have a criminal record, or he doesn't have a criminal record that might inhibit him or her from having a good future.
You had mentioned earlier the certifications one can obtain from our junior colleges. Talk to us a little bit more about that, especially in terms of veterans who may be returning from theaters of war and have garnered expertise based upon their experience.
Right. Oftentimes, especially with veterans, they have got a boatload of expertise, but they don't have the document that employers need to look at to say, hey, you can fit into this pigeonhole or you can fit into that pigeonhole. So what the community college system will do is to afford them an opportunity to get that documentation, to get that certificate, and not have to necessarily go for an entire 2 years to get a diploma and still have access to a good paying job.
And of course, that's the case for an entering student right out of high school.
Absolutely.
Who can pursue a certificate in what other field of endeavor. And I understand cybersecurity, for example, is something that's a growing employment opportunity.
Absolutely. You know, the entire field of I don't even know what you call it, but cyberspace and cybersecurity and things like that. Words that didn't even exist when we were growing up. Have opened up and afford young people as well as veterans a wonderful opportunity to get a good paying job and to be able to support their families.
And I take it there's still a need to retrain adults who have lost work as a result of the recession. That's still a number of years beyond us, but there are a lot of people out there who are unemployed.
Absolutely, and as well as, you know, with the changes in technology, which are eliminating some jobs. Yes, retraining is a big part of this, and you know it's exciting to see our community colleges playing this role. They're well situated for it. They're well suited for it. I think our neighboring state of North Carolina does something similar, and so I think you'll see this become a growing trend across the country.
And you mentioned earlier the flagship institutions of higher learning we have in the Commonwealth of Virginia. I think there's additional funding for them, but there's always a balance that has to be maintained between the out-of-state residents who pay a lot more to ensure that our in-state students don't have to pay as much.
Right, and that's a constant battle that we are engaged in the legislature. You know, on the one hand, you have institutions saying that, you know, we've sort of outgrown our dependency on the legislature for funds, and yet the legislature reminds those institutions that, hey, you wouldn't have been in a position to outgrow your dependency on us, and by the way, you're still getting money from us,
right.
But you wouldn't have been able to be in a position to outgrow your dependency on us if we hadn't invested in you. And as part of that investment, you ought to charge in-state students less than you charge out-of-state students. And you need to reserve a certain number of seats for those in-state students as well, because what you will find that they will do if you don't do those sorts of things is that they'll just go and try to grab all the out-of-state students they can, get the higher tuition dollars, and have very few in-state students going to our universities. So we understand the challenges that they face, and we understand that it's incumbent upon us to make life somewhat easier for those folks. But at the same time, they do owe a debt to the people of Virginia to make sure that our children are able to go there at an affordable price and that there are plenty of seats reserved for them.
Now, I take it there's still a great emphasis on science, technology, engineering, and math. Some people want to include, rightfully so, health and the arts.
Absolutely. You know, for a liberal arts major like myself, though, I was a political science major, I still think that there's plenty of room for a creative thinking and writing. But you're right. The way society is going today, there's a great emphasis on science and technology and making sure that we have our young people geared up to do well in those areas. Because, like, you know, any number of folks will tell you, we're not just competing with folks from Maryland and North Carolina. We're competing on a global stage, and we have to empower our young people to be able to compete in that fashion.
Now, as I recall, the governor's budget, at least in the second year, also has a pay raise for teachers as well as other state employees. What kinds of challenges does that present, however, for local school boards and counties who may not have the wherewithal as a large county like Henrico may have?
Well, you know, there's always part of the deal is that there is a local match of some form to go along with the state pay raise. And so wealthier counties have an easier time of making that match and exceeding the governor's, the recommended pay raise, and poorer localities have a harder time doing that. Nonetheless, we have to do our part here in the legislature to provide some floor, and 2% is what the governor's been able to manage in the second year of his budget. I'm already getting phone calls that it's not enough, and if we can find a way to push it beyond that, we will, but we certainly applaud the governor's efforts in that regard.
Talk to us about the need to continue the effort to wean the Commonwealth of Virginia away from government largesse, meaning federal government largesse, as a result of the number of military installations we have and just people who work for the federal government.
Well, because of our proximity to Washington, I think we are either the highest or the second highest a recipient of federal dollars into our economy. And that's hurt us, quite frankly, that dependency that we've had historically on the federal dollars as the federal government goes through cutbacks. Those cutbacks have been put off now for 2 years, and that's why we have the ability to do some investing and some recalibrating, if you will, of our spending priorities. But the governor has been on this since day one in terms of creating the new Virginia economy, giving private businesses an opportunity to come into the Commonwealth, making sure that Virginia is welcoming and to folks of all walks of life, all sexual orientations, and that sort of thing, to make sure that everybody knows that if they come to Virginia, they have a chance to make it. And by creating that new Virginia economy, we hope and we will make ourselves less dependent on federal dollars, so that as a recession hits and the federal government cuts back on its spending, we're not hurt as badly as we've been hurt in the past.
Now let's turn our attention to some specific pieces of legislation that you have introduced this session. You talked a little bit there about discrimination based upon sexual orientation. I know you have some legislation dealing with that as well.
Yes, Adam Eben and myself have, for the past couple of 3 years, put in a bill that says that the state workforce nor a locality will discriminate against a person because of their sexual orientation or their gender identification. Each one of the past 4 governors has addressed that in some form or fashion by executive order. We have 2 attorney generals, one who said that it can be done, one who said it can't be done by executive order. We need to put that debate to rest, and we need to go ahead and adopt this law as the law of the Commonwealth. It only affects governmental entities. In fact, what we see is that our private industries, our private businesses are light years ahead of our government in that regard.
So they're more progressive at this point.
Way more progressive than we are. Historically, we've always gotten the bill out of the Senate, and again, it's passed out of committee and headed to the floor in good shape. The challenge has always been a subcommittee in the House of Delegates that kills us at an hour that's way too early in the morning. But hopefully, the House will undergo a change as well, and we'll be able to get it out.
Now, background checks. I know you have some legislation dealing with that.
Absolutely. Right now, a person can sell a gun to another person without knowing anything about them, without knowing whether they're even eligible to have a gun. Someone who's in the business of selling guns, a licensed firearms dealer, has to do a background check. And so what we're trying to do is to make it so that everyone has to engage in a background check, regardless of whether you're a licensed firearms dealer or not. That's the bill in its most simplistic forms. There are exceptions for, if you're transferring it by temporarily for someone's self-protection. There are exceptions for leaving it to a child, or leaving it, by operation of will to a family member. But by and large, that's what we're trying to accomplish.
And campaign finance. I know that there's some things that you want to change there as well.
Well, sadly, the bill has died at this point. But a bill that we carried on behalf of the governor would have said that after the session ends, and we have that time period where the governor's looking at bills leading up to what we call the reconvened session, where we deal with his amendments or his vetoes, there would essentially be no fundraising. You're talking about the period in this session will be between roughly March 13th and mid-April. I think, there are a number of people who agree with me and the governor on this, that that's an inappropriate time to be raising money while you're still considering bills. You're going to go back and act on things, and what we've actually seen is that many lobbyists and interest groups don't want to give during that time period anyway, and won't give until after we're done with the reconvened session. The legislature needs to be about avoiding the appearance of impropriety. Regardless of whether we have a good motive or a bad motive during that time period, it doesn't look good for us to be raising money. But sadly, the bill was defeated, but there'll be another day.
30 seconds left. I know you want to talk a little bit about your grand larceny legislation.
Well, my bill failed, but there is a bill advancing that raises the threshold from $200 to $500. That hasn't been touched in years. Routinely, the Retail Merchants Association opposes that bill. But we've been able to put together a coalition this year of Democrats and Republicans. It's a bipartisan bill. It's gotten out of the Senate. It got out of the Senate last year, too. So we hope we'll get it through the House this year.
Good luck in the upcoming remainder of the session. Senator Donald McEachin, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Woody. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for watching Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Comcast. Until next time, I'm Woody Evans.
Mm-hmm.